practices by members of the university community. Our theme for Quality Month 2018 is Quality Consciousness, the pathway to stakeholder trust and accountability. And today we're pleased to host this webinar. Our distinguished presenter this afternoon is Dr. Anna Perkins, Senior Program Officer of the Quality Assurance Unit at UWI Mona. In addition to being a quality assurance professional, Anna is also a theologian and an ethicist. She is the author of Justice as Equality, Michael Manley's Caribbean Vision of Justice, and also editor of Quality in Higher Education in the Caribbean, a UWI publication. Dr. Perkins has also served as an external evaluator for institutions seeking national accreditation in the Caribbean. Her experience and interests as a researcher and a professional make her the ideal presenter for today's webinar, and I welcome her and welcome all of you as I hand over to her now to speak on the topic, Dying for Quality, reiterating the value of external quality assurance in higher education in the Caribbean. Anna?
Thank you, Ruby. Dr. Lynn, thank you very much. Thanks to the UTT community too for the invitation to present today's webinar and to say welcome to everyone that's joining us, and thank you for joining the conversation on dying for quality. Now, several of us in the over the last several months would have been au fait with some newspaper stories that have come out of both Barbados and Guyana. There are two stories that detained us for a little while. The Barbados Advocate and others reporting on the arrest of the CEO of the Washington University of Barbados. And then you had stories in the Guyana Guardian that reported on suicides in the wake of a scam at the Alexander American University in Guyana. And these are not the first such stories. They're perhaps the most dramatic stories. They're the ones that are holding our attention at the moment. But there have been other stories in the past of the last several years that have brought to our attention the fact that there may be concerns with transnational fraud in higher education having reached our shores right here in the Anglophone Caribbean. And the bare facts of the case are there in the media for us to look at. But I want to start off with a kind of disclaimer. In my interactions with my colleagues from the National Accreditation Council of Guyana in particular, they have pointed out that in their estimation, the source of the stories in this particular instance on the Alexander American University, they consider it to be a scandal rag. They don't take that newspaper, that media, online media too seriously. And if we do a little bit of research on the web, you'll see where they have been sort of running between the NAC and this particular newspaper before, where statements have been made that the material coming out of the newspaper is injurious and defamatory. So I just want to put that out on the table because we recognize that especially the story coming out of Barbados that's presently in the courts, and we don't know the full facts of the case. But for me, what these stories do is that the circumstances of these stories sort of highlight for us the reach of international, transnational fraud. And so it's important for us to take account of that, given that oftentimes there are extreme consequences. And that's what I found happening in looking at these two cases, that there were actually extreme consequences where I can argue that people are dying for, we talk about yearning for something, so you die for it. So I'm using it in that sense where people are yearning for quality. And I'm also saying that if the stories are to be believed, then people are literally dying for the lack of quality, because some of the extreme consequences that have come out in these newspaper stories have been to the fact where people have committed suicide, people have been at the brink of starvation. So you could argue about dying for hunger, as we would say in a Jamaican context, and so on. And there are other kinds of consequences that we would talk about as we go along. But certainly what it does is that those stories reinforce for us the importance of external quality assurance processes in our region, to protect and to safeguard our stakeholders, particularly students, parents, and national government. So that's the focus of our conversation this afternoon. Why don't we start off by looking at the Caribbean as a whole? This whole thing about global higher education, there's been an increasing demand for higher education globally. And, as I was fudging around trying to find information for this conversation, one of the figures that jumped out at me was that by 2025, there are going to be 7.2 million people globally who will be engaged in higher education in some way, shape, or form. And one of the sectors of higher education that is on a rapid rise and increase is offshore education. And in the case of the Caribbean, what we're seeing is that since the 1970s, we have been literally courting offshore medical education because we desire to cash in on the offshore medical for-profit sector, which it has been established to meet the pretty high demand that there is for medical professionals, particularly in the North American market. But then, there's the demand, but there's not sufficient supply in the places that there are on the mainland. So for-profit organizations have sort of jumped up in order to fill this gap. And what you find is that they're therefore catering to non-locals, generally speaking. Now, on a sort of last count, looking at the Caribbean region, there has been a minimum of, or there are a minimum of 60 offshore medical schools in the English, Dutch, French, and Spanish-speaking Caribbean. When I try to narrow that figure down, and I recognize that that's actually a moving target. So depending on what source you're consulting and where you're trying to pull your information from, the figures might change. But roughly what I'm seeing is that we have around 37 offshore medical schools in our region. Guyana, either depending on the counting, has 12, or do they have 5? Barbados has 4 or 5, depending on the count. And then we might need to add an additional one for Barbados because Ross is moving from Dominica to Barbados and so on. When I look at the assessed schools, the assessed offshore schools in the Anglophone Caribbean who have been looked at by CAAM-HP, that figure is 18. But again, it's a moving target because not every school that's in the Caribbean has come to CAAM-HP and asked for assessment towards accreditation. So again, the figure is really showing us that the Caribbean is a space that is seen to be accommodating of these offshore medical schools, these for-profit schools, and there are various reasons for this. There was a conversation, a piece that was written in the BusinessBarbados online source where, and I'm quoting here, Barbados has a charming tropical ambiance, is close to the North American mainland, and it has low operational costs. So you can see that as perhaps similar features that could apply across the Caribbean generally. If you look at what they're saying about Guyana, Guyana is touted as the only English-speaking country in South America. Therefore, that gives it a particular kind of attraction and so on. Follow me for a second. I want to zero in on the Bajan case in particular, the Bajan advantage that's being presented. Now, Barbados sees itself as coming into the offshore medical sector sort of behind the 8th ball. They see themselves coming in late because others have started way ahead of them. But they think that they have quite an opportunity to do well because they have pull factors that make them quite attractive to these offshore medical schools. So they're saying that the students who would come would find Barbados pretty attractive because of all the amenities that they can enjoy, the infrastructure that's there because it's on par with what they will be getting from their home countries, lovely tourist attractions and sandy beaches, turquoise waters, the warm sun, and of course, the even warmer Bajan hospitality. So they're laying it on, and any of our countries in the region could probably say a similar thing about what they have to offer. But in addition, Barbados will tell you that they have a lower crime rate. They have a very high HDI ranking. So their last ranking, they were at number 57, well-trained native speakers, and of course, the kind of geographical and cultural ties with North America. They have flights coming in from all major European destinations. infrastructure like high-speed internet has been a staple for them for many years. And of course, for persons that are interested in medicine and so on, the fact that they have a world-renowned fertility clinic would also be a draw. So make no mistake, of course, for us, we're courting them. Barbados is courting them because they see benefit. They can see how their economy can benefit, their local economy. People are going to make money because they can provide accommodation and transportation to the students and the staff, and that's going to put money into their economy. They're going to have more tax receipts. They're going to find it as a means of diversifying their export services. Their education offerings would be sort of diversified. And without a doubt, the expectation will be that these offshore schools that are coming in will also have philanthropic intentions towards the local community. So whether it's through providing free clinics and giving out medication to the poor and so on, that the community at large within which these schools will be set would benefit as well. So that's an example of the Bajan argument, the Bajan case for why they would be a good space. And obviously 4 or 5, and you could see where others may well be moving in, and they intend to take advantage of what Barbados has to offer. And of course, you realize I could give you a similar case for just about any one of the countries in the Caribbean region right now. But let's turn specifically to the 2 cases that have been in the media in recent times. The first case is the Washington University of Barbados School of Medicine, WUB for short, started in 2017, given a charter to establish and to operate by the government of Barbados. The parliament was under the previous government. Now, I've not been able to ascertain exactly what this charter entails beyond the ability to establish and to operate a school. I've not been able to find out what sort of standards are in place in order for the school to operate. And the most that I can say is that they have the permission to operate, and clearly there was some kind of fee payment that would have taken place in order for that operation to happen. Now, if you go onto the WUB website, and I'm going to quote you here what they say about themselves. They say they're one among the top Caribbean medical universities, which is recognized, accredited, and listed in FAIMER, and FAIMER is the Foundation for Advancement and International Medical Education and Research. And then they say they're also an MCI approved medical college, and MCI, I've come to realize, means the Medical Council of India. They're offering training towards an MD, 5.5-year program. They're located in St. Philip's at the Casa Grande Hotel. And this is important. They have retrofitted a wing, the hibiscus wing of a hotel. So there's not a purpose-built campus for the university, although they call it their Oldsbury campus, but it's actually a retrofitted wing of a hotel. And roughly the student population is about 200, and they're mainly coming off of the Indian subcontinent. Now, what are the matters arising that I've been able to ascertain with regards to the operations of WUB? It just started in 2017, and a few months after it started, by about April of 2017, student complaints started to be heard. And the suggestion was that at least 20 students that had come on board wanted to leave and to transfer to other universities. The understanding was that many of these students had been recruited to WUB with the promise that they were actually gaining entrance to universities either in Canada or the USA. And then it turned out that they were actually being admitted to a program in Barbados. That's the first thing. When you look at the later response of the WUB administration to some of the complaints and so on, one of the explanations that they give is that the students who ended up at WUB, many of them were actually meant to go to Alexander American University in Guyana. But there was some kind of administrative issues, and so they couldn't get into Guyana, so they had to put them into Barbados. So already you're seeing that there's some messiness in the administrative processes for admissions and that kind of thing into WUB, and certainly in tandem with some interactions with their sister campus or their sister university in Guyana. There was a letter that was prepared that was circulated in social media. And again, I'm in 2017 of April. that talked about the concerns that students had and some of the problems that they had with the accommodation, inadequate ventilation or AC. There was no food. So their admission payments and so on was around them getting an entire package where meals will be provided. And so again, my Jamaican sensibilities come out and I say, the people them are dead for hunger, them dying for hunger. Eh? Water and other amenities had been cut off because apparently very shortly bills had not been paid and then staff had not been paid for months and so on. So there were certainly a lot of losses that entailed for the students and the stakeholders of this particular institution. Well, then we also learned too was that there may well have been misrepresentation / fraud because they spoke about being showed videos of a fully functioning school that met local health standards, met all the education requirements that had been endorsed by former PM and former ministers. And the videos did include ministers of government speaking about this institution and endorsing it and so on, and assuring the prospective students and so on that accreditation was coming very soon for the institution through the Barbados Accreditation Committee and so on. And I myself have gone onto their website and looked at the virtual tour that's presenting, and it's very impressive what they're trying to show that they have and so on. But clearly what's in that virtual tour appears to be different from what's actually on the ground. And some of what you hear coming out of the staff and students are words like betrayal of trust, students talking about their hard work coming to nothing and so on. So we can talk about the consequences of what seems to be broken promises, misrepresentation, and perhaps something that extends into fraud. So we do know that in October of 2018, the CEO of the university was arrested, and that there was a result of a response to complaints of staff and students and so on. And then there was a large investigation, and it seemed to turn out that this gentleman had actually had initiated acts of fraud, or is alleged to have initiated acts of fraud in his homeland of India and so on. So the school had to close. And note, within 2 years or less of having been formed. Now, in my own research into trying to prepare this webinar, I didn't make sure to try to call the school. I wanted to know for myself, could I find somebody to speak to? Could somebody give me some kind of update as to what is happening with regard to the school? And when you make the call, it tells you that the number is unavailable, and it just rings out and so on. So I was not able to make contact or connection with anyone from the school. So it does seem to confirm that the school has actually closed down. When you look at the response of the Bajan government, they appeared to be shocked and surprised and bothered by what was transpiring. And then they have made promises that as a government, they're going to give all the comfort and support that they can to the students who have been brought into this circumstance or situation. So let's really quickly just talk about some of the accreditation matters or the accreditation claims that WOB has made. If you look on WOB's website, they give a long list of organizations that they say have accredited it. And what I've done is that I've just picked out a couple of them to examine for all purposes of conversation. So FAIMER, which is the Foundation for the Advancement of International Medical Education and Research. FAIMER is not an accrediting body. What it simply does is that it maintains a list of organizations that recognize and accredit medical schools. So WOB would not even be on their list because they're looking at accrediting agencies, external agencies, right? So CAAM-HP, for example, would show up on that list. And of course, there's always going to be the disclaimer that FAIMER puts there that says that, it doesn't imply that the medical schools in the country for which this particular agency has been recognized and accredited are themselves currently accredited and so on and so on. So that disclaimer is always going to be there. Now, when you check the World Directory for Medical Schools, and it's not showing up here as one of the so-called listing or accrediting bodies, but it does show up, I believe, for AAU, they don't show up there. at all. They say that they're accredited by WFME, which is the World Federation of Medical Education, which recognizes accreditation agencies, right? So CAAM will be recognized. They would not show up on a list of that sort. IMED, I checked that as well, doesn't exist anymore. In fact, IMED has merged into the World Directory of Medical Schools. And they simply are just a list of medical schools around the world trying to present accurate, up-to-date, and comprehensive information on each school. So they're not accrediting, they're simply just listing. And then if I looked at GAME, which is the Global Alliance for Medical Education, it's a member organization for networking of institutions who develop and market continuing medical education. So we see where there are definitely some issues on the ground in terms of claims that are made with regard to the accreditation status of WOB. Moving quickly to case number 2, that's the Alexander American University, that's in Georgetown, Guyana. They started in 2016, a year before WOB did, and they're a sister university to WOB. In fact, they share the same CEO, owner, the gentleman that got arrested. Note for AAG that they are registered by the National Accreditation Council of Guyana for a year, not 3 years, for example, as if they were registered by BAC that they would have been given, but NAC gave them 1 year. They also claim that they are registered by WHO, the World Directory of Medical Schools. And know that I said before that this directory has been discontinued and the database rolled into the World, rolled into the World Directory for Medical Schools, and they are actually listed there. What I found in the media report, and then of course too, they give you this vague thing that they are recognized and accredited all over the EU, and that they're recognized by the Medical Council of India. I checked the Medical Council of India, I'm not seeing them listed there. And how does one check all over the EU and what that means? I want to note, of course, that particularly for this Guyanese case, the media continuously, erroneously state that they're accredited by the National Accreditation Council of Guyana. They're not. They're not accredited, they are registered, which means that they meet some minimum standard that allows them to operate, but their programs have not yet been accredited. And I'm not seeing any indication that they have yet presented themselves for accreditation. 5-year program, staff and students mainly coming out of India, Nigeria, 250, and so on. So their case is very much tied in with what happened with WOB. They were feeling the blowback from WOB, and with the CEO relationship, there was closure, money spent for admissions and so on that could not be recovered. And then this is where things become a little dramatic and perhaps very problematic. The reports in the press start 7 suicides have happened as a result of people mortgaging land, selling off their inheritance and so on, in order to fulfill this dream that getting into medicine will bring improved status and wealth, and that it will get into certain spaces that would allow them to achieve this dream. So again, going back to my title, people are literally dying for quality if these reports are to be believed. And again, I did my own little investigation too beyond their website, and I've not been able to get in touch with anyone at the school to ask my question. So clearly the school is truly shuttered, and that the talk and discussion around students wanting to be transferred to other schools and so on may well have some kind of merit. Now, in my research and trying to pull my thoughts together for this afternoon's conversation, some questions kept jumping up at me that in my mind reiterate the importance and the value of our external accrediting processes and agencies and mechanisms within the Caribbean context. And they came up in different ways. I've pulled 3 of them out and tried to lay them out here for purposes of our conversation. So one question that was coming up was about whether the for-profit schools are vetted in the same way that traditional public and private institutions are. And for me, that is implying or suggesting that people who are asking that question believe that they're not, that they are being held to lower standards. And some of the questioning I see even coming out of the parliamentary space in Barbados and so on. So there's a need on our part as quality assurance professionals within the region to help our stakeholders to know and to understand the process by which this vetting happens and the standard that all our institutions are being held to, and that they're not standards that are so different or higher or lower, such that these guys can skate in under a lower standard. So there's something for us to talk about there. Then there was a piece that I found by a gentleman called Kaufman, where he was talking about paying to play. And it's a kind of very angry piece where he's himself involved in accreditation from the US perspective. So he sees these offshore schools in the Caribbean as being actually quite deadly and doing a lot to undermine what's happening in the US space, and in fact, pulling on and having access to funds that could be better spent in the US context and so on. And a question that he surfaced in his own discussion is, why not let US educators perform the site visits and evaluate the schools in the same way as he says we do in the United States? He says, if their standards are equal, they should be open to the same review. And he's complaining about what he calls pay to play, because he's complaining that the offshore medical schools in the Caribbean are paying for clinical spaces, paying for internships in the North American market. And what that means then is that legitimate students who he believes are better than the students who couldn't make it into the traditional spaces in the North American context are being pushed out because these schools are willing and able to pay for spaces, and spaces are of course limited. So you're then bringing less qualified students to take up spaces that better qualified students should be able to access. Of course, I think that he has to be careful in how he makes his argument, because, for example, it would ignore the fact that CAAM-HP is an independent accrediting body that is not being influenced by the government to give accreditation to schools that are of a lower standard, and that, in fact, in undertaking their accreditation process, what they do is that they do take account of and use the expertise of examiners and evaluators coming out of the North American space with the standards of that particular context and so on. And in fact, we have to recognize that CAAM-HP has been recognized by WFME, which says that they have standards that are similar to the standards that the traditional US medical schools are being held to in their accreditation context. So that has to be part of the conversation as well. And in fact, perhaps what I also need to throw into the mix, and this for me was interesting in looking at what was going on the ground, is that when I went onto the CAAM-HP website and looked at the schools that had presented themselves to CAAM-HP for assessment, it was kind of frightening to see how many of the schools that had presented themselves to CAAM for accreditation either had their accreditation withdrawn, their accreditation not given, or their accreditation denied. So just looking, for example, at the first three that show up on CAAM's list, there is the All-American Institute of Medical Sciences, which is one of the only offshore medical school, to my knowledge, that's here in Jamaica. They had been given initial, or what we call provisional accreditation by CAAM, and that accreditation was withdrawn July 2016. If you look at All Saints University, and that's in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and in Dominica, not accredited, July 2017. Third one, American International Medical University in St. Lucia, accreditation denied, July 2018. So what that means for me is that the accreditation process being deployed by CAAM-HP, which is specific to the medical education field and allied disciplines, clearly is working pretty well and able to keep out, gatekeep, if we want to use that, to protect the integrity of medical education and assure that persons that are going through certain schools that are in our regional space are both qualified to practice and have the ability to continue for further training and education and so on. So something else that we need to put on the table. Now, what you'll find is that lay people tend to use interchangeably words like quality assurance, registration, accreditation, recognition, and so on. They tend to use them interchangeably. And that was recognized by Vincent Alexander, who is now currently the chair of the National Accreditation Council in Guyana, but was previously in the Ministry of Education and registrar at the UG and so on. And what he says is that there's a specific meaning and it results in different processes and it signifies different status. Important for us to recognize that our lay people don't really know the difference. And I kind of think it makes sense if you think about it, because our external accrediting agencies have the whole notion of accreditation in their names. So if that's what you say you're doing, if you're offering diverse or different services, registration, equivalence, accreditation, you could see why a lay person with not as much knowledge might mix stuff up and interchange the meaning. So for me, there's a conversation about continuing our discussion about what it is that our external accrediting agencies do, ramping up our PR processes to help our stakeholders understand the work that we do, and perhaps finding ways of innovating as we try to inform the different publics that are interested in and involved in higher education within the region, so that there will eventually be clarity of understanding among the different statuses and among the different processes and so on that are involved in this larger external quality assurance process. One more slide to go before we can start our conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts and questions about some of what I'm saying and thinking. So here's where I've gotten to in the conversation with regards to these two cases in particular and what they've surfaced for me. We clearly need to revisit the processes and procedures for external quality assurance in terms of what do we do when public scandals of this nature arise. I am not clear as to what those processes are, particularly because the presence of these public scandals call into question in some way, shape, or form the processes that are in place for externally quality assuring, whether it's through registration or accreditation of these offshore medical schools. So what do we do? I'm not sure what we have in place in order to maintain, to protect the reputation, to own up if necessary, to recognize our gaps. What's in place? It also points out to me the necessity of strengthening the processes and the mechanisms of our external quality assurance agencies, particularly through evaluating their processes and procedures. There are various processes that are in place, for example, through INQUAHE, which is the international network body that many of our external quality assurance agencies belong to, that can help them to look at themselves vis-a-vis these guidelines for good practice. Where are the gaps? You know, in a perfect world, we never have scandals. And as best as we try, problems are going to arise. So what we need to ensure is that we have mechanisms in place to look at the gaps that may allow problems to surface and to find ways of filling those gaps so that we can really meet our mandate as externally quality assuring the various offshore offerings in this particular instance that will be presented to us. So for me, it reiterates the importance of external quality assurance agencies putting themselves also in a self-study, self-assessment mode and submitting themselves to external processes that can help them to see whether they really are functioning with the best standards for external quality assurance. I've not been able to ascertain, and I suspect, my colleagues at BAC and probably ACTT may correct me, but I've not yet been able to ascertain whether any of the EQAAs in the Caribbean have yet subjected themselves to an external evaluation process. Stand ready to be corrected. And then just to note in a sort of final way that one of the things that at UWI we would always talk about when we present our internal process of quality assurance to our stakeholders and our colleagues to help them to understand why we do the work that we do is that we want to ensure that we do our work well so that no one from outside is going to come and put strictures on us just because we haven't performed well. And so looking on and reading reports, for example, that the Prime Minister of Barbados has said that, she's moving forward with implementing legislation that's going to make it relatively difficult for foreigners to come there and to establish questionable offshore medical schools and so on. And then to have the discussion saying, guess what? Other local legislatures in the Caribbean intend to follow. Then says to me immediately that what we have done is that because these gaps have existed and we may well not have the mechanisms that can move very speedily to address the issues on the ground, what's going to happen is that legislation is going to come hot and heavy on the work of our external quality assurance agencies in a way that may further restrict what it is that they're attempting to do. So it's almost, we're going to find ourselves in a punitive space more and more because of the gaps that have led to different kinds of failures or to the alleged scandals and so on. So lots of matters on the table for discussion, but certainly we're in a space where we can see people dying for quality, yearning for the assurance that quality is in place as we have tried to make ourselves attractive to offshore medical offerings for the benefit that is going to bring. But at the same time, if these stories can be believed, people are literally dying because they have come to a space of hopelessness, having been confronted with circumstances or alleged circumstances whereby the quality promised to them has not been displayed. And so they have suffered severe losses, both reputational and financial and personal and so on, and seeing no way out. And it seems like some have taken the route of suicide to literally die for quality. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. And that has been really a very comprehensive overview as well as in-depth analysis of some of the issues. It's been excellent, really. Three things that stood out for me, and I want to just use that to start the conversation, is that you pointed out very early on in the presentation that there was inaccurate information that was sent to students by the institution. And this would actually be one of the things that in our standards for accreditation across the region, we've looked at, because institutions are advised that they must provide accurate information to students and potential students and stakeholders, or they would actually be in breach of the standards for registration and for accreditation. Mm-hmm. So it seems as if that would have been one of the early red flags. You also talked about the number of claims on accreditation that the institution would have made, and you went through in detail some of the agencies that seem to put forward the fact that they are accrediting bodies when they're not. And right. Again, that's happening throughout the region, where we see a lot of claims being made that people are accredited by bodies that are not really external quality assurance agencies, to the extent that I've seen where institutions are actually being bullied to some extent to accept the accreditation of bodies that are not legitimate accrediting agencies. Mm-hmm. And the third point you made was about the gap between registration and accreditation. You talked about the fact that the terms mean different things and the processes are different, but it's leading me now to also question whether the gap between registration and accreditation is perhaps too wide, and the implications of that gap really for quality. Because if registration allows you to operate with standards that are so minimal that they may compromise quality, then perhaps we need to revisit the status of registration and what that allows an institution to do. So I'm just highlighting those just to open up the discussion and to throw it out to all of our participants to ask their questions as well. One person, Anna, would have asked or said that you didn't mention St. George's University in Grenada. And was there a specific reason for not mentioning St. George's during the presentation?
No specific reason. I thought I would have mentioned it when I talked about how early we started to do the courting, because St. George's University in Grenada has now gotten itself into a position where it is a premier offshore medical university in our region. It's one that you can hold up as a flagship for how those offshore medical schools can function, and in a sense, I think that was the first one that came into the region. I think it started in 1977 and took some time to build up. And it's the success, I think, of St. George's in Grenada that opened up the door for others of us in the Caribbean to want to go after the same thing, because it was so beneficial, for example, to the Grenadian economy, that others of the nation in the region wanted to get to that same space as well. So St. George's is a good model. And I should mention it in that regard. I guess my focus was so much on the two that were the cases that I did not say enough or anything about it, yes.
So it's actually a good thing that you didn't mention St. George's during this presentation to some extent. For those who are asking about receiving copies of the slides and the presentation, you will receive a copy of the webinar itself, and you can view the webinar at your leisure, and you'll also get copies of the slides after the webinar. So Marsha is asking Anna whether there should be a greater alignment between the requirements for receiving a charter to operate in a country and the standards for accreditation by the national body.
I think there should be, Marsha, my biggest problem right now in just trying to do a little bit of research is not being able to, and I'm speaking specifically of the Bajan case, not being able to ascertain what the criteria are for the granting of a charter, beyond knowing that some kind of fee payment was involved in order for the school to, one, be established, and two, to operate, and wondering whether one agency does that, and then a second agency has the job to register this and to accredit. And how do we align the two? I think your point is a really, really important one, and conversations need to be had in that regard. Because if it is, and it is, the charter is being provided by what is clearly a parliamentary ministerial agency, and then the BAC has the responsibility of doing the accrediting and all of that. They're not aligned, but BAC is being identified because people don't know how the charter is given. BAC is being identified as the body that seems to be falling down, if you understand what I'm saying. Yeah. So some conversations definitely need to be had in order for alignment to happen, or the work of BAC and other EQAAs will continue to be undermined, because on the one side you have the government doing their thing, and then you're asking an independent accrediting agency to do something else, and they could be working at cross purposes, or seem to be clearly in this particular instance.
Yes, there was an interesting case in St. Kitts and Nevis, I think a couple of years ago, where there was actually some intention to move the accreditation body from under the Ministry of Education to the Ministry of Tourism. So that perhaps speaks to the issue that you are raising there as well. So Christopher is asking, Anna, whether you've been able to find out if that institution, the American University, really had any US affiliation, seeing that the CEO was from India, or was the word American just used as a marketing ploy?
I found no affiliation whatsoever, Chris. It's basically out of India. And I think that the name is definitely meant to be a ploy to attract people. Because remember, they're saying to students, oh, we can get you internships and clerkships in the US, you know? So I think that the naming was Washington. So they're two and they're connected, right? Washington suggests, you know, DC and all of that, if you think about it. And then Alexander, American. It seems like the Alexander has to do with Alexander the Great, because their symbol seems to be of him riding a horse. And then, of course, the American part of it wants to suggest the connection to somewhere in the States. So I definitely think, on the basis of the fact that I've been able to ascertain, that there's a lot of subterfuge and they're trying to present an image of connection that may not necessarily be there.
Very good, thank you. So I'm going to link the question from Pauline with another question that follows it, because Pauline is asking, what do you see as the existing opportunities as well as challenges for the external quality assurance agencies in the Caribbean in this context? But the other question that follows is, should CAAM-HP not be the first accreditor for the offshore medical institutions, even before the national accreditation?
Thanks for the question, ladies. No, I think the way we have our process worked out, where what needs to happen first is some kind of a registration. Any offshore institution that wants to do education in our space needs to have permission to do it. I guess that's a simple way of putting it. Somebody needs to recognize and give them permission to operate. And that, I think, has to be done by the national accrediting body. Then, when you want to look at accrediting the program itself, for me, CAAM-HP to do that. They have all the expertise. They're specifically set up to do that, while our national accrediting agencies have larger sort of mandates. Not that I'm suggesting that they, by their mandate, they wouldn't be able to do that well, because they are structured to be able to pull the kind of expertise together to assess and to decide whether an institution should be accredited. But given the specificity of the education programs that we're talking about, CAAM-HP already exists in order to do that. And I think the steps for our offshore medical schools should really be local registration and then a move to have CAAM-HP accreditation. So the two need to work in tandem.
Yes. And what about some of the challenges that this situation presents for us, and what some of the opportunities as well, if we manage it well?
If we manage it well, we can certainly see the benefits that St. George's in Grenada has writ large for us as possibilities and potential. We make no mistake, they are meant to, we're opening our shores and our doors to offshore medical schools because there is a benefit to our countries and our nation and our region, financial, and all the other things that I listed out. Yeah, if done properly, they can do well by us, and we can do well by the students. But what that means is that we have to be aware of the challenges and the gaps that are there in terms of our own processes and our own structures and systems, to ensure that we don't open ourselves to becoming a haven for what could be fraudulent institutions just coming and making use of our openness in order to benefit persons and organizations that are really about making money at all costs, and without really caring that they're giving the students the right kind of training with the right kind of equipment and research. I mean, research is a big part of what medical schools should do. And these schools have no capacity to undertake the kind of research that will bolster up how people enter into the field of medicine and practice and serve and so on. So the important point about the lack of alignment between what we ask for in terms of registration, which seem to be so minimal that you can skate in and go ahead and do what you do and say eventually you're going to come forward for accreditation. And then when you try to meet the accreditation standard, there is such an asymmetry, you know, that they're never going to be able to get it. So I think we need to have a closer alignment between what we're asking for registration and what we're going to be asking for accreditation. And possibly that means that there's going to need to be a ramping up so that the minimal is really not as minimal as it appears to be.
Right, and that kind of relates to what Alicia was saying with respect to the fact that accreditation remains voluntary, but registration is compulsory, and therefore quality must really be assured from the point of the registration, and maybe we do need to strengthen those registration standards.
I agree totally. That's part of what I was trying to say. But even though accreditation is voluntary, let's face it, it's actually something that these schools have to do. They need, for example, if they want to get their students into the North American market, they need to be accredited. And they need to be accredited by an organization that is recognized by the WFME, you know, which is beautifully for us. And, right. and this is something that I think we really need to recognize. CAAM-HP is a CARICOM, a regional body that is top of the line internationally. So CAAM-HP can accredit schools at that standard and then allow their students to be able to move into the North American market for their clerkships and their internships and so on. So although technically accreditation is voluntary, de facto it's not, because if they want to do what they promise, they need it.
Raynell is also asking whether there should be a time frame during which institutions, after they have the national accreditation or registration, must be asked to comply with the CAAM-HP.
Excellent question, and I think you're putting a point in the mix of our evaluation of the process and the breakdown. I think that's something that should be seriously considered, so that you're not coming back and updating your registration status and so on, but not moving in a direction towards getting the necessary accreditation so that you can fulfill the promises that you're making to your student. I agree, definitely.
That's interesting that Nigel is also raising the issue of provisional registration, because some of the institutions would request provisional registration, which would allow them to set up their bank accounts and acquire a lease for their property and so on. And Nigel is asking whether this opens the door for compromises in terms of quality and even the credibility of the local accreditation body by granting this provisional status when there has been no real quality assessment at that point in time.
But even if, to my understanding, Nigel, even the provisional registration that is provided is built upon the meeting of certain standards. So that is definitely one part of it. There are some standards that they're being asked to meet, and I guess it becomes provisional because there may well be other parts of the larger standards framework that's not being met, and it's provisional because they're given a period of time within which these other standards are to be met, and then otherwise they would not be registered, because that provisional registration will expire at a certain point, and they would have to, you know, provide proof that they have met the other standards before they can be given registration. So if the process works well in the way that we understand that it should, there may not be as much difficulty. It's just where it doesn't work that I think it could be problematic.
I think Lyle wanted to weigh in on one of the questions. Lyle? Or did you, Lyle, want to weigh in on one of the questions? Okay, probably not.
Muting his mic.
So we'll move on. There's another question here from Christopher, and he's saying that institutions require, do they require specific insurance with respect to if they close their doors, and what happens to students who are enrolled? So are there measures to protect students from institutions that need to shut their doors in terms of insurance or any other aspect of that?
Excellent question. I am not knowledgeable to that level of specificity, and I will say that claiming that I'm not a part of an EQAA, I'm part of an internal structure at UWI. But I would like to believe that that would be one of the expectations that would be on the ground in order to provide registration for an institution. That these kind of safeguards would be in place, because the stakeholders, the key stakeholders are our students, and we have to make sure that things go well for them. So that would be something worth investigating, or if we have some colleagues online who are from an EQA, if they could speak to that, it would be good. But yes, I certainly think that that should be in place.
Right. I know that with respect to the Accreditation Council in Trinidad and Tobago, there are some requirements that have to be met in terms of what would be put in place if the institution needed to close, and the institutions are asked to indicate what they would do in terms of teach out arrangements or transferring students to other institutions. With respect to insurance, though, I'm not aware of anything that is required in terms of having any kind of insurance for liability. So that's something we probably need to have considered by the external quality assurance agencies. So we've been going on for quite a while. We're actually going a little bit over time. If Anna would stay with us for a few more minutes,
yes,
before we come to an end of the session. There's a question from Sandra, and she's asking, do higher education institutions lack clear practical lines to develop strong quality based on their organizational culture?
Do they lack clear organizational lines to develop quality depending on their culture?
Yes. So I guess it's culture specific here.
I would say that certainly you want to assist an organization to craft a culture that is much more quality conscious, and I could see where some organizational cultures would be a lot more quality friendly than others, if that's a good way of saying it. And the recognition that we have certainly at UWI is that it takes time to build a culture that's quality friendly, a culture that is open to the kinds of questionings and the kind of self-analysis and self-reflection that quality entails. So I guess my answer to Sandra is yes. There can be, and there most certainly will be, spaces within which cultures of an organization could not be open to and not be friendly towards quality and quality assurance, and that a recognition of the importance of a quality culture at the level of the leadership of the organization would be important, and that you start to build quality over time from the ground up. Our UWI experience over time has showed us, for example, the importance of crafting a quality policy that entails all dimensions of your organization. We started over time looking at academic quality and recognize that quality is a feature, ought to be a feature of our entire institution. And that's where our experience is suggesting that others should go as they move to building out their quality culture.
Thank you. Just two questions that I'm seeing that we will entertain before we look at wrapping up. And Diane is asking about the Alexander University in Guyana, because they're still apparently on the website of the National Accreditation Council in Guyana. And yes, so she's asking whether this will be removed at some point in time. But I know you said before that they have registration for a period of 1 year.
1 year. I can't speak to whether they will be removed or not, and how NAC's processes with regard to that. But you would think that, given that it appears that the institution has closed down, it appears, then there should be some steps to remove them from the listing, because they're no longer functioning, or even remove them and put them at a point that says at one point they were registered, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yes. Yeah. And Curtis is saying that he's wondering whether there are implications for the external quality assurance agencies in the region liaising with each other before they register the offshore institutions. And perhaps because one institution may have set up operations in one country, but be seeking to set up operations in another country that may not be aware of some of the issues in the first country that they set up. And so is there a need for this collaboration between the agencies and perhaps for some special standards to be developed for the accreditation of offshore institutions?
Spot on. Absolutely wonderful questions. And, you know, this is an opportunity for us to put those out on the table and to get the conversation started. You know, is it something that we could start a conversation on through CAAM-HP, for example, which is already a network for our external quality assurance agencies in the Caribbean. But yes, I do think it's important to have that dialogue so that there's an awareness of what's going on in our region and that we can sort of help each other and protect each other and to support each other, which I think is also important as well. Can we learn from the experiences of the other? Just as how, you know, when if my understanding goes well, Ruby, and your research, when many of the EQAs were being set up in the region, they sort of modeled themselves after each other so that there was a commonality and a similarity of standards across the region, and so that we could at points have mutuality and mutual exchange and so on. So yes, I think this scandal, if you want to call it that, presents us with an opportunity to deepen the conversation, deepen the connection, deepen the collaboration among the EQAAs in our region, and we can only go up from here.
Yeah. And Anna, from an ethical standpoint, there's a question about whether the government, as in the case of Barbados or in Guyana or in any other country that has an issue with an institution that shuts down, perhaps has a responsibility towards the students or towards the members of the public who may have suffered losses in terms of the investment in these institutions. If the government has a responsibility to give a charter, then does it also have a responsibility to for some of the failings?
I definitely think it does. It does. There's an ethical responsibility when you make a promise, and by giving a charter that says they can establish and operate, you're already promising that they can establish and operate in a sufficient way that their degrees will be meaningful, students will have certain kind of job opportunities and that kind of thing. So if you promise, you're going to have to fulfill that promise, and there's a responsibility that you would then have to your key stakeholders. I'm thinking particularly about these students. They're thousands of miles away from home. They're talking about having no money. They have no food, nowhere to go. They won't be able to pay for another educational opportunity, and if we haven't done our due diligence in order to present them with the proper educational opportunities that we say would be given to them by coming into these spaces, to my mind, there's absolutely no doubt that our government, and in this case, certainly the government of Barbados, has to take some kind of responsibility. And I do think I hear that being said by the current Minister of Education, that they're going to try to provide whatever comfort, and obviously she's using that term in a very broad fashion, that they can to the students, because they have a responsibility.
So I'd like to bring our discussion to close. I would like to remind participants that they will be receiving copies of the webinar on video as well as the slides. I'd like to thank everyone for participating. I know that there's still questions in some of your minds, and certainly the discussion can continue after. But I'm going to ask Anna if she would just want to make a closing statement about the issue of quality as a trust relationship between partners.
Certainly. Just in closing, to say that if we listen to...
Your volume is a little low, Anna.
Okay, let me come a little closer, see if this will help. If you listen to the responses, for example, coming out of Barbados, the stakeholders and their sense of betrayal and their sense of broken trust, because they were presented with untrue statements, misrepresentations, and so on. Quality is about ensuring that trust is not broken in that fashion. Quality is about helping to maintain the standards that are projected and presented and so on. And quality is about ensuring that the relationship of trust that ought to exist between providers and the various stakeholders are maintained, and in fact, beyond maintained, but also improved as we go along over time.
Thank you very much for that. And so, ladies and gentlemen, participants, colleagues, I would like to first of all, on behalf of the University of Trinidad and Tobago, thank Dr. Perkins for an excellent presentation and for starting a discussion that I think we must continue in the weeks and the months ahead. I would like to thank all of you for registering and for participating in the webinar. I am Ruby Alleyne, Vice President of Quality Assurance and Institutional Effectiveness at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. This is Quality Month, November 2018. I think I said October at the beginning, it's November. And so every November, we do look forward to having you participate in some activity that would be related to quality assurance. We thank you for participating, and I would like to bid you all a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.